Hey, Kirsten.
Hi, Councillor Rebecca. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Councillor Rebecca?
Sorry, say that one more time.
Testing, testing.
Yes, I've got you perfectly. Thank you.
Welcome everyone, we're going to start the meeting. Welcome to the special meeting of the Toowoomba Regional Council for the 24th of May 2023. The meeting is open to the public and will also be live streamed. I'd like to thank those of you in the room with us today and acknowledge everyone watching via Council social media channels. I acknowledge the Mayor, Portfolio Leader, Councillor Carl, Councillors, CEO Mr Brian Pidgeon, General Manager Dr Nicola Stefanoff and everyone else. Thank you in the gallery. I acknowledge the Aboriginal parties whose songs lines traverse these lands we meet on today, the Western Waka Waka, Guyabal and Jarawar peoples, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the knowledge, the rich traditions and bold ambitions of Australia's First Peoples. Item number 2 is attendance, including apologies, leave of absences, granting leaves of absence, declarations of conflicts of interest. We don't have any apologies, but we do have Councillor Von Hoff is attending the meeting via Teams. Are you there, Councillor Von Hoff?
I am, thanks, Madam Chair.
Good, thank you. No apologies. We have one leave of absence noted, and that's Councillor Tim McMahon. No granting of leave of absences and no declarations of conflict of interest. Item number 3, councillors, is a confirmation of the previous minutes. That's a special meeting on the 17th of May 2023. Councillors Paul Antonio, Nancy Summerfield, Melissa Taylor and Rebecca Von Hoff were absent. So with that, can I have someone move that they were a true and accurate record of the meeting? Councillor Carol Taylor, Councillor James O'Shea, all those in favour? Is there any business arising from those minutes, councillors? No. Item number 5 is the suspension of standing orders. And just before we do that, I'd like to acknowledge our special guest in the back of the room today. We have a new graduate, everyone, from Logan, a new graduate planner, James Colley. So welcome, James. Thank you. All right, with that then, can I have someone move the suspension of standing orders for item number 6? Councillor McDonald, Councillor Carol Taylor, all those in favour? Now, we will have the presentation by the officer, Jayden Forbes Mitchell, and then we will have the presentation by the submitter, Ms Kimberly Halter. So, Jayden, thank you for taking us through this application.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, councillors. The report before you considers a development application for reconfiguring a lot to subdivide one lot into 190 residential lots on land at Goombungee Meringadan Road, Meringadan West. The site is within the emerging community zone and partly within the Meringadan Township expansion area within the Highfields, Meringadan and Meringadan West local plan. The site is located entirely outside of the priority infrastructure area as defined by Council's local government infrastructure plan, and the total area of the site is 18.2 hectares. The site itself is bounded by Meringadan Shirley Road to the east, Goombungee Meringadan Road to the north, land that is zoned rural to the west and southwest, and residential development to the south, with lots generally 2,000 square metres in area. Land immediately surrounding the development site is subject to a variety of development applications and approvals, which are illustrated in attachment 7, please. This includes a preliminary approval for educational establishment to the west, a preliminary approval including a variation request to establish a local centre on land to the east, opposite, and approval for a childcare centre on land to the east also. Could I please get attachment 9 up, the proposed subdivision plan? Thank you. The proposal seeks to subdivide the subject land to create a total of 190 residential lots, new roads and drainage lots over 4 stages. The lots proposed vary in size from 520 square metres to 1,415 square metres with an average lot size of 645 square metres. This represents a net density of 15.5 lots per hectare. The primary vehicular access to the subdivision will be via Meringadan Shirley Road, via a new 4-way roundabout. This roundabout will interface with the future road to the east. A secondary road connection is provided to the south via a narrow traffic calmed laneway to Curlew Street. Additional pedestrian connectivity is provided to Corella Street to the south and 2 further pedestrian-only connections to Gumbunji Maringadan Road to the north. The proposed development is subject to impact assessment and has been assessed against all the relevant assessment benchmarks within the planning scheme and the state planning policy. And further consideration has also been given to the land use and planning objectives within the South East Queensland Regional Plan. During the assessment process, Council received 16 properly made submissions and 2 not properly made submissions objecting to the proposed development. Matters raised in the submissions included concerns about inconsistency of the development with the existing character of the locality, an increase in adverse amenity impacts to existing dwellings, traffic concerns, increased stormwater flows, the interface of the development with adjoining residences and public roads, and the ability for infrastructure that currently exists to service the development. Residential development at the scale and density proposed is not anticipated under the current Highfields, Maringadan and Maringadan West Local Plan Code. Now, the proposal does comply with the dwelling density targets for the zoning of the site, being emerging community, which calls for a minimum of 15 dwellings per hectare. However, the local plan code assumes a greater level of importance in the hierarchy of assessment benchmarks in the planning scheme. Despite this inconsistency, the assessment has more broadly considered more current land use planning for the area that has been guided by regional plans. This is owing to the age of the current planning scheme and the assumptions underpinning it. The South East Queensland Regional Plan is the primary planning instrument for guiding the long-term strategic direction for land use and planning outcomes in South East Queensland, and the regional plan categorises the subject site within the urban footprint. Could I please get attachment 8 up, which shows an overview of the land use categories within the regional plan? Thank you. Now, I think just below that image is also a legend which shows, thank you, yes. The local plan code in the planning scheme was drafted when there was a former South East Queensland Regional Plan 2009 in effect. And at this time, the subject site and land to the east were all located outside of the urban footprint. Since adoption of the local plan, much of the locality has been incorporated into the urban footprint under the regional plan. Infrastructure studies have been undertaken by Council in the intervening period that demonstrate the land in this locality can be sewered and developed at a higher density based on existing network capacity. The development application is then consistent with the land use intent for the urban footprint in the current regional plan, as it promotes a compact settlement pattern and consolidates urban development within established communities. The site is suitable for urban purposes as it can be appropriately serviced with all urban infrastructure. And development of rural residential development at this location would not support the outcomes sought for the urban footprint as outlined in the regional plan. In addition to compliance with the regional plan, the development has been assessed as complying with the strategic framework in the planning scheme, and the following additional attributes have been noted in the assessment. Firstly, the development contributes to a logical pattern and sequence of development and infrastructure by consolidating residential development within the centre of Maringadan West and facilitating the delivery of a roundabout aligned with future development to the east. The development achieves a net dwelling density in excess of the minimum dwelling density targets stipulated in the Emerging Community Zone Code. The development responds to flooding constraints affecting the subject site, complies with all acceptable outcomes within the Flood Hazard Overlay Code in our planning scheme. The development provides for a range of lots that enables a variety and diversity of housing types. It establishes movement networks that support and promote walking, cycling and public transport by incorporating a grid-like pattern of internal roads with multiple connections to the surrounding road network. And the development will incorporate frequent street tree planting along internal roads and a network of pedestrian paths to create a high-quality streetscape and public open space network. As the subject site is located outside of the priority infrastructure area, The development requires the establishment of new trunk transport network infrastructure that was otherwise not planned or able to be provided through the levying of infrastructure charges. As such, this report recommends that an extra payment condition be imposed for Council's transport network infrastructure. On balance, the proposed development is recommended for approval subject to the conditions provided within attachment 3 to the report. This is predicated on the basis of the inclusion of the transport network extra payment condition included within that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jaden. Questions for the officer. Councillor Shine?
No, thanks, Chair. Thanks, Jaden, for your report. Just on that last point about infrastructure charges, you referred to transport, but I take it that the significant infrastructure charges might well be in relation to drunk water supply and that type of expenditure. And I was just, this being outside the PIA, how did it differ, if you're familiar with the one at Westbrook, the Fernley one, how did it differ from that development in terms of what's being required by way of contribution, if any?
Thank you, Councillor. Through the Chair, I'm not familiar with the particulars of the Fernley development which you've referred to, but in determining the extra payment infrastructure and whether the development could be serviced by existing infrastructure, Council officers undertook a number of technical reporting for each network, and that was the sewer, water, stormwater and transport network infrastructure. What informs those technical reports were studies that Council's done recently, which analysed the capacity of the sewer and water networks up to a period of about 2061. And there's been a number of works done in the area in recent times that has essentially meant that this development, even if it is brought forward out of sequence and outside of the sort of planning assumptions for the area, it would be able to be serviced without any, I suppose, undue burden on the infrastructure. The only exception to that was the transport network infrastructure, and that was active transport. So that was a requirement to upgrade the footpath along the frontage.
If I could, just a second one. On page 64 of Board Books, it refers to, if I can get it, under roadworks, the width of the roads. Recently, this issue has been raised as to the inadequacy, if you like, of the width of roads, particularly within a subdivision. This one has 23 metres wide, 19 metres wide, 18 metres wide, down to 17 metres wide. Are you confident that those widths, I realise that they're standard in the sense of, I take it the word standard doesn't mean they have to be that width. They could be larger or smaller, perhaps, I don't know. Is it a discretionary thing to some degree? But what I'm getting at really is, are you confident that, bearing in mind the requirement that vehicles are not supposed to park on footpaths but on the roadway, will it allow access? Is that sufficient width, especially the 17 metre one? Is that sufficient width for vehicles to pass by safely?
Thank you. Through the Chair. With reference to the road standards under Condition 88, all of those road standards are as you've noted, standard requirements under the planning scheme policy. And we would expect that all new subdivisions adopt our standard cross sections for roads. And the width of those roads will depend on the function of that street. So where it gets down to 17 metres wide, that is for those cul-de-sac roads, of which there are 2 within the subdivision. And they would typically be serving no more than 12 lots at most. As to the question about parking on footpaths, obviously that would be regulated under local laws. But the assumption is that these standard road widths that we adopt are adequate to provide some level of on-street parking and also enable cars to pass each other in the street.
Councillor Mercer-Taylor.
Thank you, Chair, through you. Councillor Shine stole my first question because I've been receiving a lot of emails, etc., about widths of roads and parking on footpaths. So that was my first question, to ensure that there was sufficient safety in vehicles or people parking on the street and being able to traverse the road. But my second question, please, is page 25 of board books. One of the concerns by the submitters is the concern that drainage and stormwater runoff will affect the neighbouring properties. You did say that, if I'm correct, that the development complies with the overlay code. Is that correct? And there will be no issues with stormwater drainage runoff?
Thank you, Councillor, through the chair. I suppose there's two aspects to that question. Earlier when I referenced compliance with the overlay code, that was with respect to the flood hazard. So there is a small portion of the site that is an existing drainage reserve, or drainage corridor rather. That area that's within the flood hazard overlay will be required to be dedicated as a drainage reserve, so there'll be no lots within that area. So flooding internal to the site has been assessed as being adequate or mitigated. The other issue that you raise and that the submitter had raised is concerns that the additional impervious area generated by the subdivision would potentially lead to an increase in downstream stormwater flows. So Council's assessment has considered the stormwater reporting provided by the external consultants engineers, which we have also reviewed, and it was determined that the downstream impact of the subdivision would not lead to an increase, essentially, in downstream impacts. And that was largely due to the timing of the stormwater coming off the site and how that coincided with stormwater from other sites being released to, I believe it was Maringadam Creek.
Thank you. May I just have a follow-up? Thank you. Can you just show me on the map, whichever map or attachment would be the best, to see where that the drainage reserve, is that what you called it, Jaden?
The detention basin, is it?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I couldn't think of the word. Thank you.
Yes, if we could please get, I believe it was attachment 9, which showed the survey plan. So if you zoom into the northwest corner there, you can see in small text it says watercourse. So it's that area of the site that's not falling within existing lots.
Right.
So it's in 3 distinct parcels there. And so the land, my understanding is, drains to the north, and it will reach Goombungee Maringadam Road, go under the road through a culvert, and then eventually make its way to the creek.
Okay. Thank you. When I enlarged it, I couldn't read the writing, so I didn't realise. So thank you.
No further questions, Councillor Taylor. Councillor Summerfield.
Thank you, Chair. I too was concerned about the road width, and if we go back to the avenues, when the avenues was approved, we went into great detail about the width of the road, the width of the footpaths, to ensure that there could be tree planting. You mentioned that there'd be ample room for walking and all that sort of thing. Well, if the road's not wide enough, then there'll be cars there, and even in the cul-de-sac, it might only be 12 houses, but that could be 24 cars. So we have to allow for ensuring that there is capacity to provide for those cars, and it's a growing issue for us in the region, and it's something that we really want to be on top of. And I understand that we're possibly restricted by the current planning scheme, but I'd like to know how and if that is the case.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll go some way to answering your question, if I may. The Avenues successfully argued for a narrower road reserve during the assessment of that application. That was ultimately adopted by Council in 2016 or somewhere around that time. This application that's before you today proposes roads that are consistent with the planning scheme requirements. So you can see the narrower roads, 17 metres. That narrowest road there exceeds the normal roads in the avenues. So this will actually be substantially wider. Yes. And you see the 23 metre roads that are identified in this application, they would serve a higher order function. So they'd be in the order of a collector or a distributor road. So they're wider, they have a larger carriageway, they have more space for parking. Then as we get down the network hierarchy, we have smaller, narrower roads that are intended for fewer traffic movements, fewer people, and they serve more of a place function. So cul-de-sacs can normally be quite narrow and still perfectly functional, with the higher order roads with lots of people using them, lots of driveways, lots of cars, they have to be wider to serve the function of the road. This development complies with our requirements in the planning scheme, which is effectively the limits of what we can condition reasonably and relevantly.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. So I guess between this and the discussions we've had earlier this week, there will be opportunity to look at that a bit more closely in the new planning scheme, I guess, in due course. And the stormwater, there'll be no more worsening as per standard, yeah. So then the only other thing I'd like a little bit more information on is the internal sewer reticulation system and the connection at the school. Can you elaborate on that? Is that a standard? The system there's quite a bit of wording in there on the sewage scheme. Just wondering if you could elaborate on that one for me, please, so that I'm comfortable with that. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. Through the chair. So there's a lot of detail on the proposed external sewer connection, which is detailed within the technical report, I believe, beginning at page 103. It's quite lengthy. Essentially, there are two options that the applicant has to connect to the sewer network. One would be through a temporary sewer pump station within the northeast corner of the site. That would not be Council's preferred option. However, because land to the east is not owned by the applicant, we have identified as a separate option for the applicant to undertake. However, this would require them to gain the consent of the owner of the land across the road. So that would be Council's preference, but we do need to provide some certainty and an approval and conditions that the development can be carried out. So the first option is a sewer pump station, which drains down Meringadan Shirley Road to an existing sewer network in School Road. And there is a sewer pump station there also that it will connect to. The alternate option is that it goes through the middle of the land to the east, and that will ultimately, the alignment of that sewer will ultimately serve as a trunk sewer main, and this is work that is identified in our LGIP as future works. This would be as I said, preferred outcome from Council, but we have provided the two options there for the applicant.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Can I ask a couple of questions, Jayden? One is in relation to the staging. I thought I read somewhere about there is more than one access, isn't there? There's the two accesses, one off Gumbunji Meringadan Road and the other one off Meringadan Shirley Road, that's right. Will those accesses be constructed straight away, or will there be a stage where there's only one access?
Thank you, Chair. That would be outlined under the conditions, roadworks. My understanding was that each of the stages, as shown on that survey plan, would be relatively self-contained, and anything shown within those stages would be done as part of that stage. So unless it's otherwise worded in the condition set, the stage 2 connection to Curlew Street would only be provided as part of stage 2. And that would mean that stages 1A and 1B would rely solely upon the main connection to Mringan and Shelley Road.
With one access at that stage.
Just the one access, yes.
Yeah.
It is, however, noted that the secondary access has been designed only as a secondary, in a way, emergency access. So traffic external to the site and internal traffic would be discouraged essentially from using that as the main access.
Can you just show me where's the emergency? Down the bottom.
Between lots 17 and 18.
Okay, yeah. I see, yep. Yeah. Okay. And my other question was around, you talk about it'll exceed the minimum dwelling density stipulated in the emerging community zone code. So the minimum is 11, is that correct?
The minimum dwelling density for the zone is 15 dwellings per hectare.
Okay.
So it marginally exceeds that by 15 and a half.
Okay,
dwellings
all
per
right.
hectare.
I don't know where I got 11 from. Okay, is there a maximum?
There is no maximum stipulated. I suppose the maximum dwelling density would be generally informed by the local planning that's done for that area. Now, the local plan code, as I mentioned in my presentation, does largely seek to reflect the existing character of the locality and the existing lot sizes. In that area, that sort of ranges between 2,000 and 4,000 square metres, depending on where they are. There are, however, other matters that we've looked at, which is the regional planning and how that has changed over time. And we've ultimately looked at what is a more appropriate density for this site, having regard to the infrastructure that can be essentially provided to service it.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Carl and then Councillor Taylor.
Thanks, Chair. It sort of makes you wonder why we actually go through the process of local area planning when it trumps the SEQ regional plan as far as priority, yet we cut it short in its life, albeit relative, as you say, to infrastructure that's available now. But it's somewhat a subjective exercise in the end, isn't it? It doesn't give the community much confidence that we go through that intense layer of local area planning in a greater depth of detail, and yet we don't actually adhere to that. And it's quite a stark difference, the average lot size here compared to what the local area planning said. Anyway, that's a by the by, probably a comment. Mike, I got a couple of questions, and one of them, this thing died on me, sorry. One of them is going back to the stormwater. If I can just get this page. 110 on board books in the technical report, and page 8 of the technical report, the blue overland flow paths there. My question regarding stormwater is how much of the subject site drains to that overland flow path or perennial watercourse or gully, whatever you want to call it? How much of that subject site drains to that that water course or easement? Do we know?
Thank you, Councillor, through the chair. My understanding was that given the current topography of the site, the land generally slopes to the northeast, and the earthworks have been designed, and the stormwater drainage network has been designed to redirect all stormwater to that drainage point under the road.
Yeah, okay, so did I interpret what I heard just then? So normal runoff, we're not sure about the percentage of that site that will normally go there, and the rest of it will be piped to that to go under the road in that watercourse area. Is that correct?
Through the chair, the finer technical details on how the stormwater achieves or gets to that location within the drainage reserve, I can't answer at this time, I'm afraid. My understanding is that this is the lawful point of discharge for the site, and all stormwater will exit the site at that location.
Yeah, look, the reason why I'm asking the question is you'll see in that green cross-hashed area to the northern side of Gumbunji, the Gumbunji Meringadan Road, that in fact is a farm residence there, and that overland flow path, or whatever you want to call it, I'm wondering whether that is the point of discharge that is in fact creek, or it actually will flow through that farmer's land and cause some sort of damage before it gets to the actual creek. Given the increased hard stand runoff and velocity that comes with that. And I'm merely a lay person here, but I would imagine there'd be quite a bit more concentrated water hitting that point just to the northern side of the Gumbunji Meringadan Road before it actually gets down into the creek. So I'd be concerned about, if I was that guy living there, how much of my property, if it is in fact my property, or that person's property, could be subject to erosion.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll see if I can attempt to answer your question as far as a non-engineer can answer your question. So when we get a development application like this under assessment, one of the things that the development engineers look at very carefully is how the stormwater is going to be managed, because if we as council were to approve things that can cause an actionable nuisance, we share some responsibility in the overall impacts. And council is invariably called out to deal with complaints and issues of unresolved matters. So we look very carefully at this, development engineers look very carefully at this. There's a concept stormwater management plan that is submitted to our development engineers to review and assess in the application. That will identify the change in fraction impervious, changes in the flood and stormwater peaks based on a range of rainfall events, and the developer will have satisfactorily demonstrated to our engineers, council's engineers, that this development manages its stormwater without an actionable nuisance. Sometimes what we find is there is a level of detail sufficient to approve a reconfiguring a lot like this, which satisfies our concerns and the issues we assess against, which is fully refined in a subsequent operational works application that's assessed by council's development engineers. What we do in all cases like this where there's the potential for stormwater issues is we condition a stormwater management plan. So we've got a concept level of detail that satisfies our engineering concerns about actionable nuisance, or the no actionable nuisance caused by this development, fully refined in a subsequent operational works application, which goes into very great detail about how that's going to be achieved: levels, pipes, velocities, volumes, detention basin size. So it is very, very carefully considered, because we don't want to put council in the long-term position of contributing to stormwater issues upstream, downstream, or on the site.
Thanks, Chris. So it would be reasonable to assume that that stormwater, regardless whether it's on the neighbouring property owner's property or if it's a gazetted watercourse, would be treated appropriately until such times it actually got to the proper creek with minimal impacts on that adjoining landowner to the north of this estate.
Thank you, councillor. So an applicant will be responsible for demonstrating to council satisfaction that they're not going to have an actionable nuisance downstream in this case. And so we, the applicant and council, then has to agree with a lawful point of discharge for the stormwater for this development site. And for this development site, I understand the lawful point of discharge will be council's road reserve. So there are some tests that are applied under the Queensland Urban Drainage Manual. And when a proponent confirms to council engineer's satisfaction that they've complied with the requirements that meet the test of a lawful point of discharge, we accept that that becomes council's responsibility. The test that will have been applied in this case is that the stormwater leaving the site and entering council's road reserve to that northeast is not going to cause an actionable nuisance on the road, which is council's issue, and then subsequently downstream, which is potentially going to adversely affect a landowner and then become council's responsibility unless it's appropriately dealt with. And we believe that this has been appropriately dealt with in this application.
Thanks, Chris. And one more question, if I may, Madam Chair. Thanks for that. Can we go to page 91 of board books? Well, it's a plan. It's the survey plan, or I'm just trying to understand why, and it's in relation to the second access. I do have some concerns with it being there, and that is, very clearly and obviously, it could end up a rat run for the back way to school for a lot of mums and dads to avoid the busy Meringadan Road that carries through traffic and Meringadan Shirley Road that carries through traffic as well. So if they can pop out across the road from the school into the drop-off zone, I'd imagine that might be a favourable sort of path down through that Curlew Street, albeit only designed for emergency access. Is there some logical reason why, and when you consider the proposal for a school next door to the west, is there some logical reason why we wouldn't have considered an access to the natural intersection there that forks off to the northwest, have it come out there somewhere? I'm not talking about bulldozing down through the watercourse, but there's enough land obviously to be suitable for a road access out there, because after all there's house lots there. Why wouldn't we have an in and an out, a sensible way in and a sensible way out, and giving people both options, and considering where future development or commercial activities might happen in Meringadan in the future, rather than one major road in and potentially rat running through existing subdivision neighbourhood to get either to drop the kids off to school on the way to town along Meringadan Shirley Road and back in through Old Gumbunji Road into town to go to work. Doesn't make sense to me.
Thank you, councillor. So when you referred to the school, were you referring to the preliminary approval for the school to the west?
No, I'm talking about kids being dropped off to the existing state school to the southeast. And if you expand that area out, you can quite plainly see a trafficable path and a more favourable one to the school that way.
Sorry, councillor, just to clarify, so you were referring to the secondary access to Curlew Street as being...
I'm suggesting there's potential, whether they want to access the school, parents dropping kids off, or actually more than likely a direct path out onto Gumbunji, Old Meringadan Shirley Road, onto Old Gumbunji Road to go to their place of work, which is most likely in Toowoomba or Toowoomba surrounds. So we're opening an access up through existing subdivision down there for a rat run potentially from this subdivision, which is an average of 640 40 metres squared, which is a hell of a lot of traffic if you equate that out to a minimum of 2 car movements per day. There'd be a percentage of that would go this way, whereas if we, as we've done with the main access and roundabout, push them out there, but also give them the option to go out onto the north and actually don't have a connector road through where those existing residents will be subject to increased traffic flow.
Thank you, Councillor.
Is there any logical reason? Was it a cost on the developer to construct another major intersection there, and so they opted for a secondary, call it emergency, quasi-emergency access, or not? I don't know. To me, it makes more sense, particularly with some small commercial centre at Maringan West to the west that could potentially develop, where people might want to frequent to get fuel and other such things now.
Thank you, Councillor. The secondary, shall I say, emergency access to the south has been designed, and there are conditions imposed to the greatest extent possible dissuade traffic from using that. As the subdivision has been designed, alone it's not a logical path of travel for most of the lots within that subdivision. It would only be the lots interfacing along the southernmost road within stage 2 that may seek to use that road connection rather than passing through the main exit to Maringan Shirley Road. I do note that we have conditioned speed control devices, which may include speed bumps and traffic calming. That is under condition 88.5 in attachment 3. So that would be, constructed to a laneway standard with a 10 metre wide road reserve and a 1.5 metre wide footpath. And as I've stated, the traffic calming could include speed humps or a driveway treatment, which will be agreed with by council at detailed design stage. With respect to your second question about a secondary access to Gumbunji Maringan Road, am I right in understanding that, councillor?
Yeah, up on the northwest corner would seem a logical place for a decent exit access. And I'm considering in the case of an emergency, although it'll take some time for trees to burn down on this estate, it's cultivation now. So, but albeit an emergency, usually good design has a major in and a major out, or vice versa, or they could be used for both around traffic flow in a hurry.
Thank you, councillors. This was actually one of the issues that was raised by a submitter. This is on page 24 of the report. The issue raised by the submitter was concern about the singular vehicular access to the subdivision. And their concern was that may cause localised congestion. When our engineer looked at the possibility of having a secondary access to Gumbunji Maringan Road within the assessment, they determined that due to the proximity of the existing intersection with Gumbunji Maringan Road and Maringan Shirley Road, that would not be desirable. Typically, with the higher order roads that these roads are, we would be seeking intersection spacing about 1 kilometre apart. Obviously, that has not been achieved for the Maringan Shirley Road intersection, but the subdivision does require at least one connection to the external road network. And this has been designed as a roundabout, which does alleviate and improve traffic movements to and from the subdivision, as opposed to a T intersection onto Gumbunji Maringan Road.
I'm suggesting a roundabout. Why wouldn't it logically lend itself to a roundabout? There's already there's already a fork in the road there now, a roundabout with 3 entries to it, rather 4 with the proposed new one. It just makes common sense to me, and I'm not the engineer, but you know, from a serviceability point of view, and who knows what happens to the south and the west of that proposed school site. That could end up being a major feeder road to the broader area of that subdividable land into the future. So, but we seem to allow subdivision layouts to turn their back on everything else, and we assess them on their own merits. This one, by the way, will end up with fences abutting, back fences abutting the main road with a pedestrian footpath along it. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but anyway. That is one concern I do have, that it's not actually thought about in the broader context, and it's only assessed on its merits within the confines of the parcel of land we're looking at. Anyhow,
Thanks, Councillor Carr. I guess that was the point I was trying to make before, although I sort of misread it and I didn't realise that there is only that one access. So, I mean, I would have thought in the context of sort of emergency, or I don't know what sort of emergency, you know, is it only bushfire emergency that you, I don't know, you know, I would have thought that there would need to be more than one access in and out. And I know you say there's the emergency one, but, you know, what's the benchmark for where you only have one access?
Thank you, Councillor. Again, I'll try and give you an answer that's non-technical as a non-engineer.
Yes, please.
But we have some requirements established in the scheme, and we have a road hierarchy established in the scheme, and a developer is required to comply with those requirements, and it's not particularly viable to try and seek to go beyond those requirements, or we're reaching beyond what's reasonable and relevant to condition. So what's been put to council is this particular layout with this particular access through a roundabout to the road network, and only this access to the higher order road network. The comment earlier from Councillor Cahill about a proliferation of fences that back onto some of these higher order roads, that's a function of the strategy established through the planning scheme to prioritise traffic flow on some of these higher order roads and to minimise property accesses. If your residential subdivision accesses its puts its driveway and its vehicles onto the very high order road, you're going to have impacts on the flow of the road network. So we do seek to balance lots of things when we look at these types of applications. In this particular one, the applicant has proposed, with a traffic impact assessment supporting their proposal, that this is an acceptable connection to the road network. We've challenged that through the assessment and sought secondary access for emergencies. And the typical emergency you may think of would be when that primary access in stage one is closed due to an accident or a police incident. A second access is highly desirable. And we have that through to Curlew Street in the southern side. But really, the engineers and the planners in the assessment were seeking to minimise the vehicular traffic on that access. So we wanted it to be available for people when they really need it, but not convenient and accessible on a daily basis. We ultimately have received an application, assessed it, and determined that it complies with the planning scheme requirements with the single primary access to the high order road and a secondary access that will function in an emergency.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, thank you. Councillor Taylor, will you just on the same
Thank-
point, Councillor Carr? I
thank-
might just jump back to Councillor Carr for a second.
yeah, and I want to prosecute that a little bit more, if I may, Chair. If you go to 87 of board books, the other approvals in the vicinity, to me, if you want to minimise access onto major roads, we've got a future proposed school there. The northeast corner of that proposal for the school site could be very well served by a major intersection, minimising entry and access to major roads via a roundabout. Where that boundary line is, the school could possibly use that as a major access and a safe one to that road. I'm not the engineer, but to funnel some 40 odd blocks I counted, which is a minimum of 80 traffic movements per day increase through existing subdivision, I would imagine if I was one of those residents would seem fairly untenable to me. And if my comments, Chris, in the context of viewing subdivisions in their own, within the confines of the allotment, was in the context of what potential do we have for future connections, and doing that sensibly and logically, particularly when we've already got three roads up there on Meringan Gumbunji Road now, the one that forks off to the north. But we're assessing this layout, and I have some real misgivings with this layout, because under our current planning scheme, that's all we're allowed to it. We don't have the potential for these lots to address a main road without driveways and have rear charged laneways where we could end up with an avenue of trees for school kids to walk safely under passive surveillance rather than a back fence and passer-by traffic. That's what we've got to work to in the new planning scheme, to make those blocks on Gumbunji Meringan Road and Meringan Shirley Road address the street, their front yard address the street with their access via a rear charged laneway and all the other services. That's how we get a better amenity for community. And that's in the context of an overall, that whole parcel of land there, because that'll all go under urban footprint eventually.
Councillor Carol Teller.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have to say I couldn't agree more with Councillor Carl. If you wanted to have a look at a lack of foresight, you only have to look at the block of land that's bounded by Ruthven Street, Stenner Street, Hume Street and Spring Street, where there's no internal road, and it's caused all sorts of issues up on there, and everything's looked at by itself. When you look at a subdivision or like this, there's so many blocks, there's an average of 2.5 cars for almost every block, every house that is built there. Roundabouts only work when the traffic's even on each leg. They don't work. They don't necessarily just work. They only work when there's even traffic on each. And believe me, I sat for many years out at the Alderley Street Drayton Road roundabout where there isn't. So you can sit there for a very long time. This is going to be a lot of blocks. They're smaller blocks. I don't like the layout. I certainly don't like the fact that there isn't a reserve that could go through to somewhere else. Doesn't have to be built, just could have been something that was left there to go through to somewhere else. And I think it's an absolute, I think it's, look, there's no local area plan there. There's no planning for the future. Just look at that up there and tell me that every one of those needs to be treated on its own. It does not. It should be treated as a whole area. And I think I have to agree with Councillor Carl. I think it's really not good, and there's no room for amenity or anything else there. It's just going to be wall-to-wall houses, cars jammed up, trying to get out onto the road because depends, or they might be the ones that are holding everyone else up if they're on the right leg of the roundabout. I don't like the layout at all, and I think it shows a lack of foresight on anybody who cares about the region there. That there is no, at least a link for a future road through to those blocks. It just doesn't show good planning to me at all, and maybe all that the planning scheme allows for us to demand, to ask for a requirement, but surely, you know, anybody who's trying to build something that the community is going to accept and take on should be looking at the amenity of everyone up there. The other question I'd like to ask you, it's very difficult to read in here, is every street going to have a footpath at least on one side? Thank you. I don't like the layout at all, and I have to agree that it's really poor not to have another, at least a road reserve, at least an area left there to link up with those other blocks.
Councillor McDonald.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Noting that we have got some submitters here, interested to hear their views on things. Just in regard to that, the submitters get to see councillors, officers' responses to the submissions before today? Do submitters get the chance to see what officers' responses are? Because a lot of what we've spoken about today so far has an officer response, which is it's just a general question. Let's maybe through to the GM, Nicola, whether submitters get to see officers' responses before you get to this meeting.
Thank you, Councillor. Yes, submitters would be able to see the officers' responses to submissions. It's not necessarily going to be prominent because they would have to actually go and look for it in the draft assessment report. But the draft assessment report is published typically on the Friday before the special meeting. So anyone who was interested in finding the report and reading the response would have had access to that from Friday.
Yeah, maybe it's a broader discussion that we could have because, you know, I think maybe submitters should be notified, you know, directly with that perhaps. But let's park that for the time being. But noting that I think we would have only received this on Friday as well, and noting that to go through it, it's a fair body of work. It's a big lot of work. The question really was in regard to the landscape plan, and there's no real reference to landscaping in it. But if you go to attachment 10, the landscape intent, and the way that the development, the treatment to Gumbunji Meringadan Road particularly, and I guess the Meringadan Shirley Road, how that is treated on the outside of the fencing, noting that we've had some developments which we've had some pretty good outcomes, I have to say, in a few, but then there's other examples where they haven't been so flash, and I couldn't find a condition. I certainly can find a condition in there around street trees internal to the development, but I was just wondering what if, or perhaps it should be considered for treatment on the outside, noting that the fences are conditioned to be built at in operational works before the survey plan is sealed. So, you know, it would make perfect sense that that's the sort of condition, if you were to condition it, would be done at that time.
Thank you, Councillor. So the conditions that we have provided relating to street trees, both internal and external to the subdivision, are on pages 67. The condition number 106 deals with all new internal roads, and that is at a frequency of 1 tree for every 10 metres of road frontage. And these will be trees capable of reaching 10 metres in height at maturity. So these would need to be planted prior to the creation of lots and established essentially in the ground. In terms of the external road network along Gumbunji Meringadan and Meringadan Shirley Road, that would be 1 tree per 12 metres of frontage, and they will be slightly larger trees at 12 metres in height.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I see that. 107. I appreciate it. I got too bogged down in the other 670 pages. So no, I do appreciate that, but I'd be very keen when we get to the submitters to understand if they've had, you know, a good chance to look at officers' responses to their queries as well. Thanks.
Jayden, on a similar sort of question, and it's probably in there somewhere, we talked yesterday about how we no longer require developers to set aside a park area. So where is the closest local park, and I forget the hierarchy now, local district, to here for these people to recreate somewhere?
Thank you, Chair. The nearest local park, my understanding, is on the opposite side of Gumbunji Meringadan Road, just to the northeast, towards the centre of the Meringadan Township. From memory, I think it was called Max Volp Park. The advice that I've received from the park section at council is that a park was not, that there's a certain number of lots and a certain distance that each lot should be from a park when we're planning our parks network. The parks section at council is intending to focus its resources on the Meringadan Creek corridor in terms of future park upgrades and planning in this area. So there was no park conditioned. I do note, however, that the drainage reserve will be public open space that can be utilised. There will be trees planted in there, but there will be no embellishments that you would expect from a park, such as seating or playgrounds or anything of the like.
Okay. Councillor Carl? Thank you, Jaden.
Through you, Chair. Jaden, it's 400 metres walking distance to a local park. Is Max Volt Park, I'd say it's at least 400 metres or more to that park, isn't it? It'd probably be more than 400 metres. That's to a local park. I don't think that's a local park. I think that's a district. I'm not sure. I don't have the facility on an iPad, unfortunately, to actually mark out my scale on an aerial map as per. Anyway, it's interesting that there's no requirement.
It has
find
been
that a bit
assessed by
odd.
parks, obviously, yeah.
Yeah, they would have obviously assessed that. Is it possible, you said, Chris or Jaden, you said that the trees would be planted before the lots are sealed? So am I to understand that the landscape provision here, although it says it's a, what is it, landscape intent plan, is there provision for that to be part of the operational works? Is that practical? Because that's one way of ensuring that we do end up with some significant reasonable trees because it's part of the assessment.
Yes, thank you, Councillor. Just on the landscape intent plan, so that is not listed as an approved document. It has simply been provided to demonstrate the applicant's intended landscaping for that site, which may include street trees and also some trees within the drainage reserve. So if we look to the conditions that we've recommended to be imposed for landscaping works, the establishment of trees obviously would be provided at each stage, as I had said earlier. The detail on the landscaping will be provided as part of a landscape plan, and that is under condition 104, and that will detail
What page is that, Jaden?
street trees. Sorry, yes, 66, 67. So that condition there outlines what we'd expect in a landscape plan, which would include street trees, internal and external, trees within the drainage reserve, fencing, retaining wall heights. And then if you see condition 105, this talks about the timing of the endorsement of that landscape plan. And that is required to be approved by council prior to the lodgement of any development application for operational work. So that's to ensure that we have a clear vision for what we're seeking for the subdivision, both in terms of street trees and trees within the drainage reserve, before we get into the other engineering requirements, and we work around what is essentially approved in that landscape plan.
Yeah, so, but if it was to be crystal clear as to the type, the size of tree and the detail of that landscaping, which ultimately is a small piece of amenity, to be crystal clear about it, it could actually be included in as part of an operational works approval. Correct or not?
Thank you, Councillor. No, that's not the way that Council's planning scheme triggers up the assessment of street trees. So we deal with street trees through the assessment of the reconfiguring a lot application, and we condition our requirements in this decision. So for the developer to comply with the requirements that are put before you now in draft for your consideration, they would have to prepare a landscape plan, submit it to council, and have it accepted and endorsed to comply with their requirements. And before it's endorsed, it will have to actually comply with the requirements that are conditioned. So particularly condition 106 and 107. So they would need to give us a plan that showed that size of tree at that spacing, and our landscape architect would review that. And if you speak to our development industry partners, you might find quite a few who've come away worse for wear after trying to talk down trees with our landscape architect. That's protected quite quite carefully by our landscape architect those plans.
Yeah. Thanks.
Are there any further questions for the officer? No?
Madam Chair,
Okay.
I might.
Kimberly, would
Oh,
you
Madam
like...
Chair, sorry, can you
Oh,
hear me?
sorry, Chair. Chair, no, that's me. Councillor Von Hoff.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Madam Chair. Through you, might I please thank you, Chris, for the information you gave Councillor Carl about the stormwater. If we go to page 26 of board books, I have interest or concerns about the stormwater impacts and the potential of flooding down Mooring and Dan Creek. We've seen in recent times what happens and the velocity of water that does actually go down that creek, and then the downstream effects and roads cut off and this sort of thing. Page 26 talks about how a 2018 document guided the development of the stormwater plans for this, and I just needed to understand how that synchronises with, we endorsed the FRPISA, the flood mapping, in 2020. So is that 2018 document, does that take into account what we endorsed in 2020 or not?
Thank you, Councillor, through the chair. I can't answer that as an engineer. I am just a planner. The technical reporting dealt with the stormwater network, and I can't answer that particular question that you do have there. But if you turn to page 247, that is the technical reporting for stormwater. And I suppose this gets back to Councillor Cahill's question earlier about how stormwater is managed and what might be the impacts, whether there's an increase or decrease. The stormwater management plan that we got with the application did not have regard to, it did not rely upon past reporting. So it assessed what might be the impacts afresh. And that statement on page 26 of the report that you're referring to, which talked about that 2018 Stormwater Management Plan guiding the development of the local government infrastructure plan, that was for the stormwater infrastructure in place at the time. If I could just, sorry Chris, can I just get a copy of that? So getting back to the technical report, page... So it's page 258. This talks about the stormwater flows running away from the site towards Gumbunji Meringadan Road. So the detailed stormwater management plan that we received with the application actually determined that there was a reduction in flows at the edge of the site. And this was, in the report, it was stated that this was due to essentially the timing of flows and how they got external to the site. There are conditions recommended to be imposed requiring an upgrade of the stormwater infrastructure, that being the culvert at the discharge location, and that is the relevant infrastructure consideration in this instance. I hope I've answered your question, but if you have, if you require any further clarification, please let me know.
Councillor Von,
thank you.
keep going. Yes, go on. Yeah.
No, thank you. Thank you for that, Chris. I guess my concern is that all of these developments and they're not taken in totality, and the cumulative effect is something that is real, but it's not reflected in our assessment process. And I just want to clarify, earlier when you were responding to Councillor Carl, so for some reassurance for me, you said if we've got this wrong, if council has not assessed this properly and there are downstream worsening effects, then we are responsible. Is that correct? Did I hear you correctly?
Councillor, it's Chris here. You would be correct that council takes on a liability when we assess these applications to get it right, because future issues will be put to council to resolve.
Okay, thank you. And sorry, I know that that's you, Chris, and that was you, Jayden, before. Excuse that.
That's okay. I've already called Jayden James this afternoon, so we're all going round in circles. Councillor Carol Taylor. So the question from Councillor Taylor was, why haven't we got an engineer here?
Thank you very much, Councillor Taylor. So currently within the engineering ranks, there's a 70% vacancy. The engineers are either out on sites that were already pre-booked for inspections, and then Adam has been away for 2 days at pre-arranged training that he's required to do.
Okay, now, Kimberly, I called you before, a false start. We're going to have another go. Would you like to come up to the front here and address the council? Use this microphone. You can just stand up if you're comfortable to do that and use the microphone. So as I said before, you've got 5 minutes. It's not super strict, but sometimes the questions might be, yeah, thank you.
Councillors, guests, observers, thank you very much for this opportunity for me to speak. I did receive an email on Friday afternoon with the 729 pages of the report, and I have done my best to read the report in detail and digest that report. I live in Meringhindane. I live about a kilometre down the road from this new estate, and I have been talking with my neighbours about the impacts of this to us, to those of us that live there. I've lived in Meringhindane 30 years. We've seen a lot of changes, and I'm not opposed to development in general. I knew when I built the house that Toowoomba would continue to move out towards Meringhindane. However, this development is not in keeping with the atmosphere and the feel of the rural development of Meringhindane. I have 4 concerns that have come from myself and my neighbors, and I'd like to talk with each of them briefly, and they have all been covered here, really. The first, though, is that the proposed medium-density housing development is not in keeping with the rural atmosphere and environment of the Meringhindane community. The application states that the blocks vary from 520 square meters to 1,415 square meters. If you look at the attachment on page 91, you'll find that there's only one block that is over 1,000 meters. There are square meters. There are 2 blocks that are 800 square meters. The majority of the blocks are between 500 and 600 square meters, and that majority is 67%, or 130 of the blocks. So 190 new blocks in this small area is, as has been earlier mentioned, approximately 500 cars, all entering and exiting from a roundabout near Meringhindane School. There's only one entrance and exit, which is of concern, and it is a roundabout, so that there is already much congestion in the roads from in that area. The roads are small rural highways, and it is of great concern about the additional 400 cars that would be entering and exiting from that area. 190 blocks would support approximately 800 people in that area if there are 4 people per dwelling. The proposal only allows for a small floodplain to be gazetted as green area. You asked about the parks. I live next to Tom Volpe Park, which is in Meringham. Tom Volpe Park is exactly 1 kilometer from the border. I walk it every day with my dog, I know. It is also a lovely area for small children, but there is a dam there that has flooded in 2020. The council came and dug out the overflow from that dam and never repaired that area. That area cannot be mowed, and it is in very poor repair. I have had many letters about this, but that park is not suitable for the 800 people. There is another park within walking distance. It's 2 kilometers away, and that's Bicentennial Park. Very nice park with a skate area, but there's not enough recreational area in walking distance for the additional 800 people that would be in this area. We're also very concerned about the stormwater, which you've already mentioned. In 2020, March 2020, there was a very large downpour that then went through Tom Volpe Park, went through the properties down at the bottom of Tom Volpe Park, and then it went across the road and blocked Meringham and Meringham West from town in March 2020. That has not been repaired. The additional stormwater from this, and you're talking about a culvert, that culvert is not large enough to be able to manage that stormwater. And the people in our area are again worried about being cut off from Toowoomba and being able to get to work. So those are our concerns. We have moved to the area because we want a rural environment. The properties around this are zoned rural, but the density of this development and the small blocks do not reflect our rural environment. And we would ask that this be reconsidered and the blocks be larger than 1,000 square meters, which is in keeping with newer developments. The average blocks are between 1,000 and 2,000 and up to 4,000 square meters. So this is not in keeping with our local community.
Well done. Thank you, Kimberly. Any questions for the submitter? Councillor Mercer-Taylor? Councillor?
Thank you, Chair, through you. Thank you, Kimberly. Thanks for coming today. Can you just please repeat, if you don't mind, that last comment that you made about the culvert?
Sure. So the culvert that they're talking about is large. It's been expanded since the 2020, but it is not big enough to be able to manage the stormwater.
Okay, thank you.
Because in a large rain event, the water goes over the road. So if the culvert were able to manage it, it would not go over the road.
Sorry, Chair, am I able to ask Jayden to comment on that, please? Thank you.
You might just want to stay here, Kimberly, just in case you've got another couple of questions,
Yes, thank you, Councillor. So this follows on from the stormwater and the technical reporting that I was talking about earlier, so page 264. When we were doing a stormwater analysis, we considered both the stormwater generated from the site, but also all of the upstream catchment, considering both approved and proposed development within those catchments. And at the bottom of page 264, it was identified by council that there were required upgrade works that were needed in the vicinity of the subject site, essentially to ensure that they function and they can cope with the stormwater. The first of these was upgraded culverts beneath Gumbunji Meringham Road to a larger size box culvert, and then That would also be an upgrade of the culverts beneath Gumbudgeon Meringanen Road downstream of the watercourse. And ultimately, the requirements for the stormwater infrastructure are necessary to service the development and to make sure that there is no actionable nuisance. That will be detailed through a detailed stormwater management plan through a later operational works approval. And that's where the detailed design is sort of run through with the engineer.
May I have subsequent question, please? Thank you, Jaden. So just looking at page 264 and those last 2 points that you were just speaking to, are they, is that the developer's responsibility or is that a TRC responsibility? Because this is outside the PIA, isn't it?
Yes, correct.
So it's a developer's responsibility?
Future infrastructure for an area intended for future development for non-rural purposes.
So sorry, the works that I was outlining earlier, that would be works that would be required once all of the assumptions that we've relied upon come true. So that is once all of the area in the catchment is developed to its ultimate potential. So this is identifying future works that would be required, not necessarily just for this development. The development itself does not rely upon this, but that would be future works for the catchment.
Okay, may I have a follow-up? Thank you. Thank you, Jaden, sorry. So in saying that then, in saying that that work is for future work and will be required down the track, is the infrastructure that is there currently sufficient for this development? And again, I actually concur with the comments made around the table that we need to look further than just this development. We need to look at it from a cumulative perspective. So looking at it cumulatively for what is currently there, and then if this proceeds, is the infrastructure there currently sufficient to handle stormwater drainage? And these works that you're talking about for future works is for future developments that come in the future. Is that correct?
Yes, correct, Councillor. And sorry for the confusion earlier. So just on that same page, 264, there are two headings on this. There is future infrastructure for the proposed development and future infrastructure for an area intended for future development for non-rural purposes. Okay. So it has been identified that upgrade works are required to service the development. They're numbered 1 to 5 on that page.
Yep.
And that would be construction of an open channel within the watercourse within the site. Relevantly, upgraded the stormwater pipes within the existing road reserves to service the eastern portion of the subdivision. And yeah, those are the works that have been identified currently as being required to service the application.
Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Carl and Councillor Taylor, are your questions for Kimberley? Or just in response to Jaden's, yeah? Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm just, we've got the submitter here, so we're just asking questions of the submitter. And then we can go back to questioning the officer.
Sorry, thank you. Madam Chair, if I could just clarify what Kimberley has just said. Tomvold Park is 1 kilometre away, and we know what it is. It's not, there are plans for it. The other one is 2 kilometres away, and I think our policy says that nobody should be more than, what was it, Councillor James? From a park. I would have thought it was 400 metres, I think. Yeah. And I think that, is that the case? I do believe that's right. And so if we're going to drop another, excuse me, if we're going to put another 400 plus people in this area, when the people there haven't got the amenity of a close park, I guess the fact that the way it is now on the larger blocks of land, that people mostly drive to get to a park with their children. But if you're going to put a high density population of people in this area, I would expect that, I suggest that you would think, and that's obviously your comment, that it's not good enough for those people. At least a third of them would probably have children. So, and I don't have small children, but I like to walk in a park with my dogs.
So did you have a question for
So
Kimberly?
yes, I do, I guess, and that you've said that Parks said that that's okay. I put to you that I would like to check that because I think that goes against our own policy.
Thank you, Councillor. The application was referred to the Parks and Recreation branch, and they take these types of applications very seriously. They run them through a test against the desired standards of service for parks, which is sitting in the planning scheme. They have a number of requirements, and it ranges from 400-metre walking catchment for a local access park all the way up to the district and the regional parks can be much further away. So you're correct in that 400 metres is the target distance. The advice back from our Parks and Recreation branch, because when Parks requires a park, it's got to be paid for by somebody, and then it's got to be maintained in perpetuity by council. So Parks is so Parks and Recreation branch is charged with that maintenance, and they're very careful to apply the requirements in the scheme, which identifies the 400-metre preferred walking radius for a local access park. In this particular instance, Parks is doing some longer-term planning for a linear park that will have access to creek corridors. So there is some planning happening in that space. It may not happen immediately as this development progresses, but there is an intention to deliver parks within an appropriate walking catchment for this development.
And if I can have a
follow-up,
follow-up,
you to show me on the map where that is? Can you show me on it?
the linear park doesn't seem to me to be big enough, and I understand. Thank you very much, Chris. I understand that, but I don't accept it. The people there don't have a park that's 400 metres away, and a lot of these people, it could be 10 years before they have a park within 400 metres. So I don't, and then it'll be up to the public to pay for it, not the developer to pay for it.
So are you able to show us on the map roughly where it is that parks are?
Councillor, I can't point to a location on the map, but I can point to the creek corridors that run through this area, and particularly, do we have a larger scale map with a bit more space around it? Yeah, thank you. And can we zoom out one more step? So we can see the creek running all the way along here. We don't have any clarity around the exact linear corridor that's being discussed. It's too early for that, but we have an understanding and an undertaking in the assessment of this application for our Parks and Recreation branch that their focus is on linear park that will have access to creek corridors in this vicinity.
And I say to you that it could be 20 years, 10 to 20 years before that happens. I can't support it.
Now, Councillor Carl, I jumped over you. I'm sorry. Have you got a question for Kimberly? No? Did anyone have a question for Kimberly while she's here? Sorry, we're making you stand up. Yeah.
Thank you, and thanks very much, Kimberly, for representing the submitters here today. You've mentioned about the culvert, so you might want to touch on that, but I wanted to sort of go back to the Tom Volk Park and wondered whether there's been some, this is aside from here, but obviously there's an issue there with the Tom Volk Park. So is there, have you had conversations with our teams?
We do not, 5 minutes. Do not get me on Tom Volk Park. I will go way over my 5 minutes, yes. But I have been in conversation for 3 years with Tom Volk because of Tom Volk Park and the dam that's there.
Okay.
The dam was, when I moved there, 2 acres, and it was beautiful, and it had a island in the middle, and it was maintained by Crow's Nest Council. So in the amalgamation, there's been a lot less care for that dam, which is 150 years old and was put there for steam trains. And that, you can actually see that in this top corner top right corner, that area. But in 2020, there was a big rain event after a big drought event, and there was a hole then punched into that dam. And consequently, the Toowoomba Regional Council came and lowered the spillway so that the dam is almost empty, which to me is a big shame. However, my complaint has been that for the last 3 years, the dirt from that has been left. So council made a mess, I'm sorry to say that out loud, and they did not come back and clean up their mess. So it's a lot of weeds, there's snakes, there's rats, there's rabbits. It's very uneven ground. It's not stable. Children come and they'll ride their bikes through there and slips and falls, and it's a mess. And so I write a letter about every 6 months. I don't try and hassle council, but I just say what's happening with that. And there is a plan, but there is no timeline and no money, is what I was told 2 days ago.
Okay, thank you. Now, just the second part is around the culvert.
Yes.
And
yes.
So at the moment it's a problem.
Yes, so consequently, because there is no spillway on this dam, it's been lowered, and the dam no longer holds water, the storm water runs right through, past the dam, through 2 farmers' fields, and then into Maringadan Creek. So that then is, when it rains, a substantial rain, cuts off Maringadan Road. And then there's another new development on top of the hill on Spees Road. And that new development is putting all of the storm water down into that creek. So not only is it coming across from the dam, from behind Maringadan Main Street, but it's also coming down off that hill at a rate of knots. So there's going to be storm water coming through from 2 different directions into that creek without even this subdivision feeding into that creek. But the culvert itself does not handle stormwater. Stormwater goes across. The bridge that's there at the bottom, over the creek, was damaged in 2020, and the tape is still there for repair works.
Thank you. I guess the assessment from the stormwater engineers suggests that there's actually a reduction in the stormwater that would go into that area. So it would be very hard then to condition this development to contribute to any other works outside of their site. Would that be an assumption that would be reasonable?
Thank you, Councillor. It would be fair to say that the assessment has determined that the impacts from this development can be managed by appropriate conditions, and the details of how that works and what the quantities look like and what the size of any culverts or pipes or the depth or the batters of any drainage channels, that's all worked out in the OpWorks application that development engineers review very, very carefully to make sure that council is not liable for introducing new unacceptable impacts.
If I could have one summary phrase, and that would be, the residents would like this development looked at in the context of the entire Maringadan region. We are having new developments, 1,000 squares, 2,000 square meters. We have other things that are going on in the region, but this development is absolutely out of character with what the rural property is in Maringadan.
Thank you very much, Clem Millie. Appreciate that. Now, Councillor Carr, back to you.
Thank you. Jayden or Chris, I hear what you're saying, and this subdivision's been judged on its merits according to the technical and planning. I still find it somewhat strange that there is actually no on-site detention. If you talk about timing and the best mitigation measures for the future and taking into account, I can't see how, given that this is one of the lowest parts on that area there, you see the cultivation to the west, and then the drier cultivation area to the dam right to the western side of that photograph. That's all hill that slopes down to this highlighted lot. And then there's a percentage of the stuff to the south that also slopes to there. So I would have thought that from an overall network perspective and a cumulative effect of further development in this area, which is inevitable, we would have been considering some sort of a on-site detention to suppress even greater volumes beyond the boundaries of this development, and i.e. The school, for one, will push water straight out, whether that goes along Meringandan Gumbunji Road or it hooks up with this, I don't know. But it just seems strange that for great parcels of land like this, there hasn't been any on-site detention considered as part of an overall network. And I can appreciate what the lady's saying here. Whilst it may flow in downstream, it's still these other developments that she referred to. It can still cause the creek to back up with stormwater flowing in. So it's an up or downstream nil worsening effect. I just really find it strange that there's no, yeah.
Thank you, Councillor. And again, I'm sorry that I'm not an engineer, but I can relate what development engineers have advised me about detaining stormwater flows low in the catchment, and that is not always the best solution, because low in the catchment and very close to the creek or the river that's going to ultimately receive the flows, if you detain, you increase the likelihood of a coincidence of peaks coming off the site and coming through the watercourse. So these things are looked at very carefully by our development engineers, and when detention on site is an appropriate solution, it will be expected and required and conditioned as necessary. And when we're very low in the catchment and detention on site may actually cause an increase in flood peaks by coinciding flood peaks or stormwater flow peaks from various locations, all in the one flush downstream, it won't be considered an appropriate solution.
Yeah, no, I'm just drawing reference to East and West Creek. There are a number of detentions, both high and lower in the catchment, and they work like a sink overflowing, but you can have a cup in the sink, and until the cup fills, it then drains out in the sink and goes down the plug hole. So I'm drawing that same analogy because I remember that analogy very well around those detention basin networks within the city. And that's all I'm saying is this is a fair area of land that will be subject to, and lots of that runoff goes towards this corner. But anyway, I'm not the engineer. Madam Chair, are we going to, I don't know, without presuming the room, are we going to have an opportunity to debate here? Because I would like to make some comments about both parks and LAP stuff.
Yep, of course, Councillor Carl. Councillor Summerfield, did you have a question?
If I may, thanks. Concerns have been expressed by quite a few of the councillors in relation to the stormwater. And I'm just wondering, we saw a briefing the other day on a few of us on the LIDAR, and just wondering whether this is the sort of thing that we should be using that asset for, and has it been used in this instance so that we understand exactly the water flow, exactly the impact that's going to happen in relation to stormwater? Whoever. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Councillor, I can't comment on that, whether LIDAR was used or whether it should have been used in this situation.
I would add, Councillor, that what we have received in the application and assessed in the application and put forward to you today in the recommendation is based on a degree of comfort around the concept information that's been provided for the assessment. You can see by the report, 700 odd pages, it's considered very carefully. We don't take these things lightly. The full details associated with stormwater will be assessed in a subsequent operational works application, and that is where we get a great deal of comfort that we can resolve issues and make sure that whatever is approved at reconfiguring a lot or material change of use stage actually is going to be achievable and it's not going to cause significant adverse impacts off-site. Whether we use LiDAR for that or we don't will come down to the specifics of the site. I suggest we will ultimately end up with much greater detail than what we have in the LiDAR mapping. When we get our operational works application, it will involve detailed survey.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I guess from my perspective, and I imagine all the councillors here, is we don't want to get down the track and find that there are impacts from it. We know of older developments, when I say older, pre-amalgamation, where approvals have happened, farms nearby are being impacted, and it's council that has to pick up the bill, and in turn that's the ratepayer. And so our concern is always that we get the best outcome for those around these developments, but also the best outcome for the ratepayer's dollar. So you can imagine our concern, but I appreciate those reassuring words. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, Councillor O'Shea.
Thanks,
Sorry
Madam Chair.
for missing you before.
That's no drama. Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Kimberly, for speaking before as well. I don't want to go back on old ground, but I think it's important just to get a response or to reinforce, I suppose, from listening to Kimberly speak and so many people that we see in these examples, the hardest thing to understand or to even get a grasp on is when you talk about how it fits within the code, and it seems fairly straightforward around that it doesn't fit the medium density or the block sizes or things like that. But obviously, if you can just talk through that process or how or why that, how that's reached, like understanding, because you know what I mean. Like if you're in the public, and I mean it's been brought up again as a result of that. That's one of the key things you look at. You say, well, it says medium density. This is our rural setting, and this isn't fitting of what our rural setting is.
I suppose explaining that that connection between the urban footprint in the South East Queensland Regional Plan and what was intended for this area.
Correct. Yes, thank you, Councillor, and through the Chair. The report does acknowledge the inconsistency with the local area plan, and it is noted within the report also that the local area plan was drafted at a time when this site in particular, and also other sites to the east that are now zoned emerging community and within the urban footprint, they were actually within the South East Queensland land use category, which essentially prevented their subdivision from small lot sizes. So the local area plan was very much informed by the regional plan in that regard. When we've done our assessment, we've acknowledged the inconsistency with the local plan, but we've looked toward the direction that the Meringadan locality is going towards, and that is certainly informed by the regional plan, but I would imagine it would also be informed in the near future by the development of the new planning scheme and growth modelling for the Meringadan community. The trend that we're seeing, and I suppose the key objective of the urban footprint in the regional plan also is to utilise sites that can be utilised for urban development, so they can be serviced by infrastructure. They do have that connection. Have those sites developed at the density that can make the most use out of that infrastructure. And the regional plan also seeks to limit or essentially prevent further low density or very low density rural residential type development within land that's zoned or within the urban footprint in the regional plan. So that is the direction that this location is moving from, sort of a very constrained area with very low density development to something that is more akin to a low density type area with lot sizes ranging between 500 and 800 square metres. And that is very much informed by the regional plan.
To answer your question, Councillor O'Shea, yeah. No further questions for the officer. Can I have someone move that we reinstate standing orders, please? Councillor McDonald and Councillor Shine. All those in favour? Okay, councillors. So the recommendation is before you that council approve application number RAL 2021 7453 for a development application for development permit for reconfiguration of a lot impact 1 lot into 190 pursuant to the provisions of section 60 of the Planning Act 2016 and subject to the conditions in attachment 3. Do I have someone move that recommendation, please?
Can I, no. I was just going to ask a question beforehand. We shouldn't have to go out close because it may be an amendment to, or maybe a different motion. Currently, the ratio is 15.5 lots per hectare. Is that right? And the planning scheme or the zone that it's in is 15 lots per hectare. That's the amount that it should be. Is there a way of conditioning this to make sure that it fits in 15 lots per hectare as part of this motion?
So, councillor, to clarify, the 15 lots per hectare was the minimum density sought. So
the minimum density sought was 15.5.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Sorry. Yep. So, did I have someone move the recommendation here before us? No. Yep. Moved by Councillor Antonio, seconded by Councillor Shine. I understand you'd like to go into debate. So can I have someone, Councillor Antonio, speak to the recommendation? Thank you.
Well, I will reserve my right, but I just want to, I think our planners have done an extremely good job in the circumstances. There's absolutely no question about that, and there's a whole lot of questions that need to be, areas that need to be worked on, I think, in the future. There's no doubt in my mind that as this area develops, there'll have to be improvement in the water flow. There'll have to be parks as people get there, and I think the foundation's been laid for a new community out there. These are very, very early days, and if you look at any community when it begins, you will find that similar circumstances existed. Now, if I were there, I would probably have a different opinion. I think the lady that presented did an excellent job and showed the passion that she holds for the area. But I think if we were to go the other way, if we were to knock this back, I think you'd find that the ratepayers at Toowoomba would pay a very, very serious amount of money to ultimately have that development done anyhow under the rules. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Councillor Antonio. Speaker against? Councillor Carl.
Thanks, Chair. I too appreciate the amount of work that's gone into this from the planning staff, the engineering staff, and I don't take that lightly. However, I'm also concerned about, rather than having the fear of the litigation flag waved over the head, I'm more concerned about the whole of life cost to the legacies that are left, and there are numbers of them. And they're all best practice of the day. The thing that concerns me the most is that we, with the constraints we have under the current planning provisions and planning scheme, and I'll explain those in further, we're prepared to ignore a higher order local area planning exercise that we spent a lot of money, a lot of ratepayers' money in developing around what was best practice of the day. And I think we should let this run its course. One, it offers a degree of certainty to the residents in the community there now. Two, the current restraints that we have are in direct relationship to the poor instruments we have around controlling subdivision layout and design, and how we treat higher order roads, and how we have limited levers to pull in the current planning scheme, and how a subdivision is assessed against the current benchmarks. And that is, you know, I mentioned before, subdivision and design layout makes a hell of a difference to people's amenity. Full stop. how, and I explained an example there before of how the treatment and how houses address major roads with, in this case, it would be plantings in the next 20 years, would be a wonderful linear park that is naturally in front of, and people have multiple accesses to from this subdivision. But now they have back fences to walk along, no passive surveillance for school children walking to school. They're the sorts of things why I think we should hold the line on the current LAP designed in the context of what the restraints are in this planning scheme and the planning provisions, rather than just say, oh, well, it's going to go this way. Because if you ask yourself honestly, would you buy an average, and there's smaller lots of approximately 600 square metre lot in this location when you are largely isolated from any reasonable facilities, services and amenities other than by car? So what are we creating here by jumping the queue and just assuming that the SEQ assumptions are the best planning methodology for us to pursue at this point? I say hold the line until such times we're right in the middle of the development of a new planning scheme. We could end up with some better outcomes, albeit they would be smaller lot sizes to the LAP, but as far as amenity and connectivity for future residents in this area, it's a hands down for me, hold the line. Thirdly, and finally, I am unconvinced that funneling people down an existing subdivision road, and I counted 40 lots in that stage 2 that would probably conveniently access that road to make their way into town, to work, into Toowoomba, to their place of employment, which most of these people probably will be. That is untenable, as I've said, for that community to put up with. So I don't think there has been due thought and consideration to the overall impacts and road connectivity and network, and I still say there should be a major second entry and exit to this subdivision. So that's why I can't support it. I put myself in the place of a person who may live adjacent to this, and I also put myself in the place of a future resident with minimal amenity, disconnected from shopping centres, doctors, those sorts of things. Ahead of time, we've seen some other examples of these subdivisions ahead of time and what I call isolated, that really are not practically 600 square metre lot connected to facilities closer to Toowoomba, absolutely, because you've got much more accessibility. I don't think we're creating amenity here of any sorts, really, other than some suggested street trees. Thanks, councillors.
Thank you. Is there a speaker for the recommendation? Councillor Shine?
No, thanks, Chair. First of all, from my perspective of this project, I did need to be satisfied with respect to the width of the roads, which I obtained an answer from the officer, and also with respect to the cost, bearing in mind, cost of infrastructure charges, bearing in mind it being outside the PAA. Those answers have been given and are satisfactory to my way of thinking. It's not a question of being able to hold the line until the next planning scheme is dealt with. We live in a time of huge housing shortage in this country, in the state and in this town, and it's incumbent, I think, on this council to show that we are aware of that and that we are doing all that is reasonably possible to address that shortage. it may well be that this project here is not perfect, but on the basis of the opinion of our qualified planners, seems to me that it is a good project, and we should not allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good in this instance, bearing in mind the critical need for housing and affordable housing, bearing in mind the size of these blocks, that this project would appear to me to provide.
Thanks, Councillor Shine. Speaker against? Councillor Antonio, would you like to wrap up, summarise?
Well, I think this is an interesting challenge, and if when I view these sort of developments in their infancy, there's a number of things I look at, and I've seen photos of East Toowoomba in its infancy too, where there were no trees and there was, you know, it didn't look very pretty at all. But if you look at it now, you know, it's one of the most livable places going. Look, I just want to pay my compliments to our staff to work through this. You have stuck by the rules. You have done what has to be done. And in my view, yes, we as a council need to work towards getting those parks out there. We need to work towards making sure the drainage is right. It should have been done, I guess, by the developer, but it's not going to be done by the developer. And it, under the current rules, the actual new culverts, those sort of things aren't going to be done, or there would not be a new park being built. But in saying that, I don't know if we've got too many options here. And one of those options is to approve. The second one is to face long-term litigation through the courts.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Antonio. So I'll put the vote. All those in favour of approving the application? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Councillor Von Hoff?
Opposed.
We may have lost Councillor Von Hoff. All those against? 1, 2.
No, Madam Chair, I'm here.
What was your vote, Councillor Von Hoff?
Opposed.
Okay, so that's 3 against and 7 for. So the motion's carried.
Can I call a division of vote, please?
Thank you. Thanks, Jayden. Thanks, Chris. Dr. Nicola. Thanks, everyone else. That's meeting concluded.